Hello there my lovely jewelry makers, I'm Christina of CSLdesigns, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to make these braided diamonds wirework bracelets. And as you can see, you can achieve many different looks depending on your personal style. Now if you like what I do on this channel and you want to support me, of course you can always like, share and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. There's also a super thanks button down below, and you can join the channel to get perks like early access, extra content and more. Otherwise, if you want to learn how to make this bracelet, then keep watching. So these are the materials that we're going to need. Now the wire I'm using is a regular round silver coated copper wire, and this gauge is a 1mm. Then the beads that we're going to need are 3mm rounds and 4mm rounds. And the specific ones I'm using in this case here are metal spacer beads, as they tend to have very generous holes. And I'm also using two different colours. Of course you can choose your colours however you want to. Now if you struggle to find beads with holes that are large enough to take the wire through, you can always go down in gauge on the wire if you need to, for instance a 0.8mm instead. That would still work fine. And then of course we'll also need some findings. So I've got a lobster claw clasp and extended chain and a few jump rings to put it all together. You can of course use whatever kind of clasp you prefer, or even make your own. As for the tools, we need some flush cutters so we can cut our wire, some tweezers and nose pliers to help manipulate the wire. I'm going to use some 6-step bail making pliers for any loops we need to make. You can of course use round nose pliers for this as well. And then I highly recommend getting something like a spring clamp or ring clamp to help hold the wires together while we're braiding, so it's easier to work with. So like usual, you can of course find the full material and tool list in the description box down below, along with useful links. Otherwise, let's get started. So to make this braid, the lengths of wires that we'll need to cut is 4 lengths here of about 40 centimeters each, and just make sure they're nice and straightened out so we don't have any kinks or bends. And then I've just made sure all the ends are even here, and I've then put the ends through my spring clamp, about 10 centimeters of tail or so, and then we're going to start braiding with the rest of them. So I've made sure to then have my beads ready so I can just grab them when I need them, as we're going to be alternating between them. But what we need to do first of all is get started with the braid. So you just want to separate out your wires a bit. What I'm going to do is focus on the 2 middle ones first. So I'm just splitting out the outer ones just to give us a bit of space. And what I'm going to do is basically cross the 2 middle ones over each other. So I'm just taking the left one and crossing over the right one. And then the right one goes under the left one, of course. Now don't worry too much about how the beginning here looks, because we can always go back and just adjust anything when we're going to finish off the ends anyway. So this is the starting point, and I then want to kind of separate out the sides so we have 2 lengths on either side here. And straight away I'm going to go in and add my first beads, and we're going to add them to the 2 inner ones, so the 2 that we crossed over there. And it's going to be the larger beads, which in my case are the copper ones. So I want to add 1 to the inner one on the left side, and then 1 to the inner one on the right side. So they are sitting basically right next to each other there and kind of in the way of each other, but that's just a starting point for now. Then we need to move the outer ones into the middle, so that's going to be the constant process of this. And because it's a braid we're talking about here, we constantly also just want to think over, under, regardless of what we're moving. So here, the middle ones, the left one is crossing over. So that means, for instance, if we then take the outer left one here, that needs to cross over in the opposite way. So that means that it needs to come underneath this next one as it's coming in towards the middle. And you could also look at it, the one coming from the right is going under and then over. So that is just what we want to keep thinking about as we're making the braid. We always want to do opposite to the previous crossover point, because that is how you create the braid. Now the same principle for the outer right one. So that needs to cross opposite to the previous crossover point, which means that one was over. So that means this wire coming out to the side needs to go under next. That means I need to take the outer one over it for that to come under. And I'm basically just using the beads to push these wires around as I'm bringing them into the middle. And as you can see, I've then straight away gone underneath the one that's now in the middle. That's the one we just crossed from the opposite side. So get everything in place and kind of flatten things out once we've moved the wires. As you can see, it looks maybe a little bit odd and wonky right now, but we can fix that up later on. Just focus on getting started with the braid process. Now what we need to do is add our next beads to get our first little cluster of the large beads, or square or diamond, or however you want to look at it. So I need to add again the larger beads, one on either of the two inner ones. So I'm just going to add those on the two that we just moved basically. And what we're going to do is when they reach down here into the middle, we're going to make sure they just push past that crossover point on both of them. So they now end up sitting and form that square or diamond, however you want to look at it, with the other two, so the first two that we added in, and they're all sitting right budging up next to each other and actually touching each other. So after this, we've added our first little cluster of the large beads. We now need to start adding the smaller beads, and I'm going to add them before I move any more wires, because we added beads on the upper side of this crossover point. Now we want to add beads on the underside, but again to the inner wires. So I'm going to get my smaller beads, and I'm going to use 3 for either side this time instead of 1. So I'm adding 1, 2, and 3 on the left inner one, and then just swapping hands here, and then doing the same, adding 1, 2, and the third one on the right inner wire. As you can see, they're sitting just on the other side of this most recent crossover point, and we're then going to use those beads to guide where we're going to bend or move the next wires. So we're always going to take the outer wires and bring them into the middle, and we're basically going to use the beads along the way to dictate or kind of shape the wires around, and that's how we're going to achieve the effect that we are going to end up with. So starting on either side, on the left here, I can see the previous crossover point. This wire that I now have to go over or under, that's coming underneath the previous crossover point. So that means it wants to come over on the next one. So that means the outer one here, I'm bringing underneath for it to be the over one, to line up nicely with the pattern of creating that braid. And I'm then shaping it around up against the outer bead there. So using those as my measurement, you could say, of where to put the wire. And then the outer one on the right side, same principle. You could also look at this one previously comes underneath, and then that means now it wants to come over. And again, I'm holding everything in place to make sure everything stays where I want it to be, the beads mainly. It's coming over that wire, but up against the last of those 3 beads. And now what I like to do straight away is just cross the middle ones in the right direction. So remember, this one that we just moved is coming underneath, then it goes over. That means it wants to come under the one in the middle. And then we can just bring everything together here, and you can kind of see the effect that we're getting already. And what we've also ended up with is the perfect spacing after where the beads are here, to basically add another 3 of our small beads to finish off this diamond or square in the middle with the silver beads in my case, or the small ones. So that means we need to add 3 to either of the inner ones. So I'm just going to be doing that. 1, 2, and 3. And then just swapping hands, and on the other side here, again on the inner one, we have 1, 2, and the third one. And then just like we did with the larger beads up here, we now need to push these past that crossover point and basically into the place where they're going to finish off that square or diamond with the smaller beads. And you can see they fit just perfectly. And then, because we've then added beads on that upper side of this crossover point, I want to then start just adding the ones after, so we can then use those to guide where we need to shape and bend our next wire. So again, on the inner ones, I'm adding 1 of my larger ones on either side here, and let them drop down, and these will stay on this side. So you can see the first cluster of the large beads at the top, a little square there. We have in place, we have the first diamond or square of our smaller beads, and then we're now working on the next cluster of our larger beads again. And I'm going to use these 2 that we just added to guide where we need to bring the next wires. So again, let's just check the crossover point. The one in the middle here, this one coming out towards the left, is coming underneath, so that means I need to go over, which means the very outer one needs to be brought underneath it to all fit nicely together, and then into the middle there, and again just right up against the bead, so that kind of acts as a stopper of where we need to put the wire. And on the right side, this wire in the middle that we need to go over or under is going over previously, so that now needs to come under, which means I'm bringing the outer one over it. And again, I'm shaping it. Make sure you get some nice curves here on the outer edge, and then pushing that in towards the middle up against the bead, and it's coming over the first one, and then that means it needs to go under the other one in the middle there that we brought from the other side. You can see here we have then the first half of the next cluster of the large beads, and we also have our wires perfectly positioned to add the next two beads there that are going to be the large ones, just like we did at the beginning. So I'm just going to grab another two, add them to the inner wires, just one to each, and then this is where we want to push them past the crossover point to just fill in those gaps, you could say, that are the perfect size just for those beads specifically. And we now have our next cluster of the large beads in place. So this is basically what you want to keep doing, and you just want to try and make sure to hold everything in place, because obviously things are moving as we're making the braid with the wire. But in this case here, it might look a little bit uneven, but once we then get the wires into the next position, it will then help settle the previous little area in place. So next I need to add 3 of the smaller ones, because remember we finished off the cluster of the large ones. So I'm just going to add 3 of the smaller, in my case silver ones, to each of the inner lengths, like that on one side, and then these ones we just want to let sit on this side of the crossover point, and 3 on the other side, because these are now going to guide the next movement of our wires. So before we do anything with moving any wire, just make sure everything is sitting properly, so no beads have accidentally crossed to the wrong side of a crossover point. But if you're happy, I like to put my fingers on the beads to help them stay in place, and then just double check obviously which wires need to go over and under. So I need to bring the outer one here under the next one to come into the middle and go right up against that last bead, and then repeat on the other side, except here make sure we're bringing this one, in my case it's coming under previously, so that means it needs to go over now. So over that next one, make sure we get a nice curve tight up against the bead there, so using those beads as guides. And if anything moves around while we're doing anything, just put it back in place and deal with it while we're here, and then it comes underneath the one that was already in the middle there. And just smooth everything out while we're working with the wire, because it does get warm from our hands and fingers, which can kind of put a little bit of misshaping into it. But just smooth it back out if you need to. And this is the point where you can then tell the next inner ones are perfectly positioned to add another 3 of the smaller beads. So we're just going to do that. So 3 on either side of the inner ones, and now to finish off that diamond or square of the small beads, we just want to push them past that crossover point, but of course not past the previous ones there on the side. So we have now completed this diamond or square, and like I said, we just want to repeat doing this over and over for however long we need this to be. So next, before we move any wires, we want to add 2 of our larger beads, 1 to each of the inner ones here, and they will guide us in where we need to place and move our next wires. So as you can see, this is how it's building up, and it does appear a little bit loose as we're making it, but that is just kind of in the area that we're working in. Once you've then placed your beads into place and then kept moving your wires for the next position, then the previous areas will become much more locked into place and stable. So you basically just want to keep doing this like I already showed you. Just keeping track of and paying attention to bringing the right wires over and under depending what fits with the previous crossover point. So just keep doing this until you have the length that you need, of course minus the clasp that you're going to use as well. So now that we reach the other end here, to finish off, what I'm going to do is, after this last cluster of the large beads, I'm going to just add one small bead on either of the two inner wires. Let those drop down there, so just like that. And then I'm basically going to repeat the same way. I'm going to bring the two outer wires, one on either side there, into the middle, and I'm just going to use these two last beads that I just added as the guide. So it's not going to be a large diamond there that we're going to make, because we just want to kind of taper off the end nicely, but otherwise it's the same. So bring the wire around and then up against that last bead. In this case I'm going underneath, and on the other side I'm going to bring it over and under, and again push it tight up against the bead, so you can kind of see here that it cages in those last ones nicely. And then we are done with making the braid. So what we need to actually do is then finish off the ends. Of course, so what you just want to do as well is on the other end you can remove the spring clamp there and then just add those two beads and finish off this end the same way that I'm going to show you on this one now. So what we have are the two wires in the middle there, and I'm going to use these first to finish off, but then also one of these wires is going to end up being the loop where we're going to attach our clasp. So they are crossing over in the middle. What I'm going to do is take, in my case I'm just using the back one, putting my pliers onto where that crossover point is, so up against, and then bending it upwards and away from the piece, so straight out from the end there. A nice angle into it, and then the other length that's in the middle, so it's crossing over it, I'm going to just wrap around right on top of where that bend is, and just a few times. Make sure your wraps are nice and tight so everything is nicely fastened in place. And once we have our wraps in place, I'm going to then take my cutters, cut off the excess here on the back. So that is now one wire gotten rid of, and just make sure you push down the very end, because otherwise you can feel the little end of the wire with your finger, and you just want to make sure nothing is going to catch or scratch on skin while we're wearing it, or clothes for that matter. So just push that in, and then we have our other two lengths left. For those, what I'm going to do is this one here, on in my case the right side that we're looking at, is coming over the previous crossover point. So I'm taking that and bringing it underneath the wire that's coming straight out from the end, but above where the wraps we just made are. So that's in place like that, and then the one from the other side is coming under, so I'm bringing that over. So basically we're going to have these two lengths kind of going in a spiral, almost chasing each other, you could say. So you just want to continue wrapping these around above that first wraps, those first few wraps that we did. So just want to do this a few times until you feel like it's nice and secure enough. And then I like to finish off my wraps on the sides here. We can then go in and cut off the excess, and then we've gotten rid of two more wires. And of course again, just make sure to tuck in the ends by just squeezing them so nothing is sticking out. And then we have this length left that we're going to make our loop with. So I like to just put the piece sideways here and then put my pliers just a few millimeters above where that final wrap is, and then put about a 90-degree bend into it to the side, so it looks a little something like that. And then this is where I take my 6-step bell making pliers or round nose pliers, put them on the bend, then bring the wire all the way back around to create a full circle that I'm then going to grab onto with my pliers to make sure that stays in place while I'm then wrapping this length underneath the circle, filling in that little space that we left. Just doing a few wraps here, nice and tight, until we don't have any more room left. We can then bring it to the back again and cut off the excess. And that is then the final wire finished off. And we now have a loop ready to attach our findings to. Of course, on one end you want to attach one part of the clasp, and on the other you just want to finish that off, like I said, in the exact same way and attach the other part of the clasp. And then all that's left to do is shape it. So now I've added my clasp as well on both ends, and to shape it you can either shape it around something that has a size and shape like a bracelet mandrel, or you can use your hands and fingers. So I like to go into one place and start putting a curve into it and basically move back and forth, adding more and more of a curve. So don't go into just one place and do a big bend because that'll put it out of shape, but the aim is to gradually get it more and more into shape so we can get the two ends closer together, and of course use the clasp. So once you've done that, your bracelet is finished and ready to wear. So that is how you make this super cool braided diamonds wirework bracelet. And as you can see from the ones I've made here, depending on the materials that you choose to put together, you can get many different results. But once you get into the technique and learn how to do it, it's actually pretty simple. So if you like braided jewelry, please feel free to check out my channel. I have loads of different tutorials with especially braided wirework jewelry. I have a whole playlist just for that. I'll leave that in the description box down below. Otherwise, I really hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for watching it, and I'll see you in the next one.